Hey, welcome to our first lecture. This first section of the course is going to focus on plant diversity and evolution. This is one of my favorite sections of this class. It's got we get to look at, investigate all of the major lineages of plants, focusing primarily on land plants, and use the phylogeny and our increasing understanding of phylogenetic relationships among plant groups to understand the evolution of all the innovations that have led to the diversity in each of those major groups. Throughout a lot of this, I'm going to emphasize the evolution of the life cycle. As we're going to learn, life cycles in plants are quite different than life cycles are in animals. And there's variation in those life cycles in these different groups. The material that I'm going to cover here is covered in a mix of required readings for you. The first of those is in our textbook, the Freeman textbook, and that is we're going to cover material in Freeman from chapter 28 if you're using the 6th or 7th edition, or chapter 31 if you're using the 5th edition, which our condensed volume is that 5th edition. I'm going to supplement this with required reading that's already posted on BB Learn. It can be found in the additional readings folder and then in the required readings folder inside of that. And this is an excerpt from the Encyclopedia of Life called Plants by Donahue in 2002. And actually a lot of the structure of the way that I go through this follows that Donahue chapter quite well. So these are our two required readings, and I would definitely encourage you to read those as you're learning this material. So 450 million years ago, the world turned green with the origin of land plants. And we have a really abundant fossil record throughout this time period that lets us sort of explore the evolution of plants on land throughout this slice from 400 million years ago to the present. And so I want to walk through sort of our evidence, our fossil evidence for the timeline of land plant evolution. And so the first, like I mentioned, that first fossil evidence is the origin of land plants from about somewhere between 470 and 410 million years ago. And our first evidence of land plants here is actually from a couple of different fossils. The first of those that are shown here is the cuticle. And I'm going to go through what the cuticle is, because this is a really important innovation that allowed for the transition to land. So I'll just mention here that a cuticle is a waxy layer on the outside of land plant body, outside of their leaves and stems, that actually prevents water loss. And so here's a fossil fragment of a cuticle from 450 million years ago. There's a couple of other fossil evidence that show us this transition to land about 450 million years ago, and that includes spores. So plant spores have, as we'll learn, are covered in a compound that allows them to both preserve in the fossil record as well as prevent water loss and protection from UV radiation. And then we also see sporangia, and sporangia are a structure that contains spores. And so those three things are all associated with that transition, that first transition to land. The next major part of land plant evolution and the timeline of land plant evolution is something that we call the Silurian-Devonian explosion. And so I know that all of you have likely heard of the Cambrian explosion. The Cambrian explosion is about 500 million years ago, and this is where many of the major body plans of animals arose in the fossil record. This is touted as one of these major events in animal evolution, and it's one that's talked about in most textbooks with a lot of emphasis on its importance. And so I bring this up because what we haven't heard about, or what most people haven't heard about at this point, is the Silurian-Devonian explosion that happened between 410 and 350 million years ago. This is equivalent to the Cambrian explosion for plants. And so what I mean by that is that most major morphological innovations that would include things like stomata, these are pores that allow plants to have gas exchange, vascular tissue that allow plants to get larger and to move water and nutrients throughout the plant, roots, leaves, things that we're already familiar with. But all of these major morphological innovations are present or arise during the Silurian-Devonian explosion. Major morphological innovations are present. And so really, this is just like what we see in the Cambrian explosion with animals. We see lots of these major body plans in the Cambrian explosion. Same thing is going on with the Silurian-Devonian explosion. So this is just as important of an event, maybe more important of an event, since we're talking about plants and the foundation of ecosystems on land to have happened during plant evolution. The next major period in this timeline is the Carboniferous. The Carboniferous is a time where we see some of our big land plant groups start to emerge. This includes a group that we're going to learn quite a bit about called the lycophytes. These are related to ferns. They reproduce by spores, but they're not ferns. And the horsetails. Both of these groups are very abundant in the Carboniferous, and the reason that this is actually called the Carboniferous is that this is where we see most coal deposits are formed during this time period, and they're actually the fossil remnants of these major plant lineages at that time. Following that, we see some of the groups of plants that we're actually more familiar with, and the first of those are the gymnosperms. And so gymnosperms include groups like our conifers, or our pine trees and cedar trees as well. And so during this 280 to 150 million years ago or so, both wet and dry environments are dominated by gymnosperms. And so this is really the first time that the Earth is blanketed with green plants in both those wet and dry areas. And so this is an important time frame where these gymnosperms are quite abundant. Our last time period is the more recent, from around 150 million years ago to the present, and this is where angiosperms are the most abundant group. These are so that's right now. These are all of our flowering plants, is what the angiosperms are. And so at this time, the flowering plants are really dominating all ecosystems at that point. And this is a really interesting transition, as we'll see. Most of these other groups of land plants are relatively small in terms of numbers. For example, gymnosperms now account for around 1,000 or so species, where angiosperms' present diversity is over 300,000 species. And so this is a major transition to have the abundance of angiosperms. Throughout these lectures, we will look at what major innovations are arising across the phylogenate to give rise to these different groups and potentially to promote their diversity and success. So the first thing for us to look at is, okay, well, what do we call plants, and where did plants come from, and what do we call green plants? And so plants, like many groups, have the group that we call plants includes both our glaucophyte red algae, our glaucophytes, our red algae, as well as our green algae and land plants. This whole group is called Plantae, or another name for that group, that's actually a more descriptive name for that group, is the Archaeplastida. Archaeplastida is actually a name that refers to the synapomorphy, or the shared derived character that makes a plant a plant. And so you should ask yourself, what is it that makes a plant a plant? If I was in class with you today, I would be asking you for responses, and the first response that I often get is they photosynthesize. And that's absolutely right. Plants do photosynthesize, but there are other lineages that photosynthesize. So while plants photosynthesize, the glaucophyte algae, the red algae, green algae, and land plants, there are other groups that photosynthesize. There are euglenids that photosynthesize. There are diatoms that photosynthesize. Brown algae photosynthesize. Dinoflagellates photosynthesize. So there are many different groups that actually undergo, use photosynthesis to transform light, energy, and carbon dioxide into sugars and for their energy. But we don't call all of those plants. So photosynthesis alone is not actually the synapomorphy for plants. The synapomorphy for this group, Plantae or Archaeplastida, is actually the origin of the chloroplast. And that is through primary endosymbiosis. So just like we've done before, I'm indicating a synapomorphy with a little tick mark on the branch that's leading to all of this diversity. And so everything that we call Archaeplastida contains plastids that are the origin from primary endosymbiosis. And I'll explain that in just a second. But before I do that, I want to just define Archaeplastida here then, are eukaryotes with primary plastids. Okay, so where did those come from? Well, if you think back to your other intro bio courses, the origin of the chloroplast, or those primary plastids, actually comes from an endosymbiotic event where a photosynthetic bacteria, a cyanobacteria, was actually engulfed by an ancestral cell, a eukaryotic cell, engulfed that cyanobacteria, and then over time, that became what we know of now as the chloroplast. And then what's really cool is how this was actually discovered. And so this was hypothesized by Lynn Margulies, who actually looked at the number of membranes that surround the chloroplast and noted that there are multiple membranes surrounding the chloroplast. Those multiple membranes are due to that prokaryotic cell, that cyanobacterium with its membrane, being engulfed by a eukaryotic cell with its membrane, that then once those two are engulfed, those things end up the chloroplasts end up having two membranes surrounding it. And so having those multiple membranes was a clue of the origin of the chloroplasts. Chloroplasts also have their own DNA. And so they were able to sequence the DNA of those and compare the DNA, the chloroplast DNA, the chloroplast genome, to the genome of bacterial lineages, and that's where they discovered that the chloroplast genome's closest relative are from cyanobacteria. And so recognizing this primary endosymbiotic event, this is what gave rise to photosynthesis in eukaryotes. Then how did we end up with these other photosynthetic lineages? Well, those photosynthetic lineages are actually the event of one of these unicellular ancestors of our Archaeplastida being engulfed by other eukaryotic ancestral cells. And so those gave rise independently to other photosynthetic lineages. So all of these are the result of secondary endosymbiotic events. Is there any morphological evidence for this? And there certainly is. And so you might think back to where did the original hypothesis about endosymbiosis come from? Well, it's those numbers of membranes. So if we have this ancestral plant lineage now, this ancestral Archaeplastida, it has two membranes around its chloroplast. When this gets engulfed by another separate eukaryotic cell, then we have multiple different membranes surrounding it. And so we end up with 2 and 3, and in some cases 4 membranes surrounding the chloroplast in these other lineages, which are evidence for these secondary endosymbiotic events. So when we talk about plants in general, what we're talking about is the Archaeplastida, this clade that contains all these organisms that are the result of, with chloroplasts, that are the result of primary endosymbiosis. So that's our synapomorphy for plants. So plants includes more than just what we think of outside our land plants. They include the glaucophyte algae and the red algae, the green algae, and the land plants themselves. Now we have another clade nested within this Archaeplastida clade called the land plant, or called the green plants. And so that clade, just like Archaeplastida, has a special name for it, and that name is the Virida plantae. Viridis is green, so viridi refers to green, and then plantae to plants. That's the name of the clade that is the green plants, and that is restricted to green algae and land plants, those two. And these have a series of a number of synapomorphies that unite these groups together, the green algae and land plants. The first of those is having both chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B. Where other lineages, so other plant lineages, like those glaucophyte algae and red algae, have only chlorophyll A. That's the first synapomorphy. The second synapomorphy for this, for the green plant group, is using starch as a storage tissue or a storage compound. So converting that photosynthate into starch for storage. And then finally, these have cellulose and pectins in their cell walls. And so a number of morphological synapomorphies for green plants, the Virida plantae, including both the green algae and the land plants. So let's take a look at, and I'm going to focus from here on out on the green algae and land plants, and looking at those innovations and that evolutionary transition onto land, and then the diversification into the different plant lineages on land itself. So that's where our focus is going to be. Okay, so when we look at green algae themselves are strictly aquatic. And these are, I'm showing you a couple of different groups of green algae here, represented by Coleochaetae, and then Chara, or the stoneworts. These are two groups, the chlorophycean and carophycean green algae. Don't worry too much about those names. I'm going to introduce you to those in just a few minutes. But these are strictly aquatic. These are always living in water, and many of them in fresh water. When we talk about land plants, we talk about we're going to talk about two major groups of land plants. One of these are the non-vascular plants. And so non-vascular, these are things that don't have vascular tissue. It includes liverworts and hornworts. You're probably not as familiar with those two groups, but this also includes the mosses. Mosses, I think most people are familiar with. And you've probably seen liverworts before, but not actually recognized that this was something that was different from a moss. Hornworts are a little more rare in our flora, and so there might be something that you haven't seen. They look very much like liverworts as well, and I'll show you some pictures and go through some of the diversity of these non-vascular plants. The other name that we give to this group that includes the liverworts, hornworts, and mosses together are the bryophytes. So these are our non-vascular plants. These are plants without vascular tissue. So they don't have any vascular tissue that is used to conduct water or provide support. And as such, these are small plants, typically quite small, close to the ground, and living in wet areas because they don't have vascular tissue to conduct water throughout their bodies. The second major group of plants that we'll talk about are the vascular plants. And so vascular plants are those with vascular tissue, as the name implies. And we can break these out, and we will talk about two parts of those. Seed plants, so vascular tissue, and they make seeds. These include all of our gymnosperm groups, all of those gymnosperms, as well as the angiosperms or the flowering plants. These are all seed plants with vascular tissue. We also will talk about seedless vascular plants. And so these are ones that do not have seeds, but still have vascular tissue to move water and nutrients throughout the plant. And these include those groups that I mentioned to you earlier, the lycophytes and horsetails that make up that whole Carboniferous, as well as a couple of other groups, so whisk ferns, and then the ferns that most of you are familiar with. These are vascular plants that don't make seeds. They actually reproduce by spores. And we'll be looking at the life cycles of all of these, so hopefully this is a little bit of a primer towards where we're headed. The important part here is that vascular tissue allows for a larger size. And this has a lot to do with both support, which the bryophytes lack, and moving water and nutrients from where it's available in the ground or in the soil to other parts of the plant where those aerial parts that water is not immediately available. Okay, so we're going to use the phylogeny throughout this, and I'll elaborate on this phylogeny to sort of walk our way through the evolution or the transition from green algae to land plants, and also to understand the evolution of the life cycles in these groups. And so on this very simple phylogeny that I've drawn out, we have green algae here. And then we have, and so those are, remember, those are strictly aquatic organisms. And then we have our land plants, which are made up of, in this simplified version, just the bryophytes and vascular plants. So these are our land plants. Another name for the land plants, as we will talk about, is the embryophytes. So phyte means plant, embryo means it produces an embryo. Now we'll talk about where that characteristic evolved. You'll notice that many of the clades, or many of these monophyletic groups that we'll talk about, have names that actually correspond to some of these major morphological innovations. I will, throughout this lecture, we're going to revisit this slide, and I'm going to expand on this slide, adding groups in as we go, and expand on this slide with respect to the each of the synapomorphies. I'm not going to talk too much about those here, except to mention that there are some major transitions that are not well understood. When this is our understanding of the phylogeny, green algae are sister to a land plant group, and bryophytes are sister to the vascular plants, it actually makes it difficult to explain the origin of many of the characteristics that we're going to see in these different groups. And so it's a hard stretch to figure out where these different characteristics evolved. And so I have put in here miracle on these, saying that it's like not well understood how all of the different characteristics leading to land evolved when we look at our green algal ancestor. It turns out that we actually, with this sort of coarse phylogenetic information, it's very difficult for us to interpret that. But once we are able to understand the phylogeny better, the interpretation of these evolutionary transitions actually makes a lot more sense. And so we're going to work on understanding both at the same time, looking at our increased understanding of phylogenetic relationships, as well as how that helps us interpret the morphological characteristics and those morphological transitions that we see throughout the evolution of these different plant lineages. Okay, I'm going to stop this first video right here, and we will pick up with this in our next lecture.